Places in America where the road goes quiet, where legends still breathe, and where the line between truth and folklore blurs. From haunted highways and cryptid sightings to stories that have echoed through generations, State of the Unknown takes you deep into the shadows of America's strangest corners. Hosted by Rob, this documentary-style podcast blends immersive storytelling with real research to uncover the tales that refuse to fade. If you like your mysteries murky and your folklore just a little too real, you might already be living in the state of the unknown. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
Research and recording of Canadian creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
After winding through the rural community of Leeds County, Ontario, through the rolling hills and the cedar swamps, a young lawyer from Kingston finally arrives at a quaint and quiet hollow, deep in a shaded valley. The area is slightly eerie, but also in a weird way, kind of peaceful. He makes his way to the weathered log cabin, and he sits at a table across from a woman in a dimly lit room. By the candlelight, he can see that she is a petite woman, dressed in all black with a shawl. Her hair is pulled back tight, and all he can focus on are her bright, penetrating eyes. It's as if she's staring into his soul. The air smells of tea, dried herbs, and wood smoke. He passes her 25 cents, and she begins to swirl a teacup around in her hands. She glances down into the teacup, concentrating hard. "I see," she starts, "that Bytown will become the capital of this great home we call Canada, and you, good sir, will become its leader." That lawyer was John A. Macdonald, and in 1867 Canada would become a dominion, and Macdonald did indeed become the first prime minister. Bytown, which is now present-day Ottawa, would become the capital, fulfilling all of the woman's prophecies. When you think of the word witch, what most likely comes to mind is a hunched woman with a wart on her nose riding a broomstick and stirring a cauldron with her faithful black cat familiar by her side. Once upon a time, women were hanged and burned at the stake for being witches, associated with the devil and doing his bidding by the Puritans. However, in 19th century, the word had taken on a new meaning. It was around this time that a religious movement called spiritualism was sweeping the world. Now, I have covered stories on spiritualism both here and over on my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. But if this is your first time tuning in a nutshell, spiritualism was the belief that life after death does in fact exist, and that there are certain people, mediums, who could communicate with the dead and relay the messages to their living loved ones. The Victorians were obsessed with seances and the occult, so being a witch was more of a folk title rather than an accusation of being evil or in league with the devil. In Ontario, a witch referred to a fortune teller, someone having a sixth sense, or a person who could solve mysteries and find lost objects. They were knowledgeable about herbs and animals, and they weren't feared but rather sought after. Enter Elizabeth Martin, who would become the Witch of Plum Hollow. The date of her birth is really unclear. Some records state that she was born in 1800, while others say it was 1794. Regardless, she was born in Cork, Ireland, as Jane Elizabeth Martin. By all accounts, she was a well-educated woman for the time, which would later help add to her reputation. Her father was a landlord and a British Army colonel, and her mother was of Spanish gypsy descent. Now, as a teenager, Elizabeth refused an arranged marriage, for you see, she was already madly in love with a young soldier named Robert Harrison. So, in 1814, she and Harrison eloped and moved first to the United States, and then soon after to Cobourg, Canada. Her parents were furious by her rebellion and disowned her. In an unfortunate turn of events, Harrison would die young, leaving her and their young son behind. About 4 years after his death, Elizabeth would meet and marry David Barnes in 1831. He was a shoemaker from Connecticut, and together they would have 9 children, 6 sons, although only 4 would live past childhood, and 3 daughters. In 1843, the family moved to Sheldon's Corner in Kitley Township near Plum Hollow. By all accounts, David was not a very reliable man, and he left Elizabeth with 7 other children, taking with him their youngest son, Sam. She was now alone and needed to find a way to support her children. And so, to make ends meet, she started charging 25 cents for fortune-telling readings. People would come to her tiny little cottage where she would read their fortunes and give them advice. With her mother's Spanish gypsy background and with Mother Barnes, as she would become affectionately known as, claiming that she had psychic powers because she was the 7th daughter of a 7th daughter. Word of her ability spread through the area like wildfire. Word of how amazing she was traveling fast through Canada and even into the United States. People traveled all over to consult with her. She totally played into the stereotype, dressed in all black with high-collared dresses covered in an apron and a shawl. She was described as having a wiry or thin frame and was petite, just barely 5 feet tall. Her hair would often be pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes had this strong and piercing gaze that made people feel seen through. She was known for her strong and commanding yet calming presence, as well as her honesty. She would perform tea leaf readings, and her most popular service was finding lost items. There are a few quotes from local newspapers at the time, although the exact name of the papers was lost over the years. However, local historians have said that regional Ontario papers wrote things like, quote, "She reads a man's life as though it were written before her," and, quote, "No secret is hidden from the Witch of Plum Hollow." One even noted that, quote, "Farmers swear she finds lost cattle better than any tracker." And in the folklore columns that had collected memories from people who actually knew her, you will see lines such as, quote, "Her eyes could see through you. She spoke softly, but her words struck true." People didn't just go to her for her fortunes. She was amazing at finding lost objects. People went to her when something had vanished and nobody else could figure out where it had gone. The farmers in Leeds County talked about her helping with wandering livestock. A cow would slip off into the bush, or a team of horses would get out. And instead of wasting more days searching, someone in the family would suggest going to Mother Barnes. She'd tell them where to look, and they'd come back saying she'd been right. There are also stories about her pointing to stolen tools and household items, and going as far as to identify the thief. A neighbor would swear something had been taken, not just misplaced, and after a visit with her, they'd head to a specific property or a corner of a field, and they'd find exactly what she described. These are the kind of stories that built her reputation. It wasn't just fortune-telling, but very practical. This is where your missing thing is, directions, that people around her took very seriously. In the 1860s, a local man named Morgan Doxtatter from Charleston Lake goes missing. Morgan and his cousin Edgar Hart had moved to the area in the fall of 1860. Hart reported that Morgan had drowned accidentally. A search party was led out, but no body was ever discovered in the area. So the constable, hearing about Mother Barnes' uncanny ability to find lost objects, thought, if she can find keys, I'm sure she could find a body. So he goes to her and asked if she could help them locate the man's body. And she did. She told the constable that the man's body was hidden under a fallen tree and was partly submerged in water. Morgan's body was found under the exact conditions that Mother Barnes described. And as it would turn out, Edgar Hart had actually murdered his cousin as part of a love triangle gone wrong. He was charged with murder, found guilty, and hanged in Brockville.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast. You're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Ni-ki-na-gana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Ni-ki-na-gana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led, resistance, and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit PayYourRent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
Now, the spiritualist movement was full of both supporters and naysayers, and one of the loudest naysayers was Harry Houdini. He wasn't dabbling in it or watching from the sidelines. He went all in on calling out mediums. He sat in on seances, took notes, and then showed people exactly how the tricks were done. He believed that many of these mediums were using stage methods such as cold readings, which is when a medium would throw out general statements and watch how someone would react. Some other tricks were spirit rappings. People in dark rooms would hear knocks and taps and think it was communication from the dead. Houdini showed how mediums used their feet or knees or hidden devices to make these sounds. There were also plenty of other methods, but these are just some of the more popular ones. At one point, Houdini even went to Washington in 1926, and he told Congress that spiritualism was, in his words, a fraud from start to finish. He pushed for a law that would have made fortune-telling for money illegal in D.C., and he kept showing up in newspapers explaining how he caught mediums using stage techniques. So, it is entirely possible that Mother Barnes was also tricking people. I mean, at one point during an interview later in her life, she was quoted saying, "I am a bit of a fraud." Of course, there are those who would argue that what she was really saying was that she didn't see herself the way that others described her, rather than actually admitting to running a scam. But we have no way of proving that she wasn't using cold readings. She did have a keen sense of observation, and because she was a trusted person, she knew more about people and what was going on in the town than most other people. She knew what rumors were being said, by who, and about what. So, this could explain how she knew that Hart had killed his cousin, or where to find the missing cattle, and the like. As for her prediction for John A. MacDonald, well, even though he was a lawyer at the time, his rise in politics wasn't exactly a secret. It was something that was widely and openly talked about. There were many public speculations about his becoming the leader of Canada at the time, so it's not like she was just wildly guessing. Also, Bytown was in talks of becoming the capital. Also, you can't underestimate the power of folklore and a good story, especially in the 19th century. So she was able to gain trust with her mother's gypsy background, and she was notorious for claiming that her powers came from being the seventh daughter of a seventh daughter. In many folklore across the globe, it is believed that the seventh child holds great powers of healing and prophecy. Often, a seventh child would be given the title of doctor at birth, as they are said to be born carrying a cure. Some say it's for evil, but people said that if you placed a specific object in the newborn's hand before they ever touched their mother's breast, it would shape their gift. So, for example, if you gave them a worm, it helped heal skin disease. You could give them herbs for curing cancer, and other objects could be used for lifting curses. It is said that they could walk between worlds and touch someone just to see their life path. Folklore was something that held much power in this time, and it's completely possible that she leaned into this quite heavily. I mean, what else was a single mother of 7 to do? She died on February 4th, 1891, after fighting a bout of pneumonia. And just like her birth date, the details of how old she was when she died are also fuzzy. Some accounts place her at 90, but others say 93. Either way, she left behind 7 children, 47 grandchildren, and 14 great-grandchildren. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Sheldon Cemetery in Leeds and Greenville. A stone was eventually resurrected for her, but at a much later date by a couple who wanted to honor her, local cheesemakers Claude and Ella Flood. Now, because the stone came at a much later date, the dates listed on the stone are incorrect. It currently reads, Burial Place of Mother Barnes, 1794 to 1886. At the time of her death, there were many newspapers who wrote glowing articles about her. The Windsor newspaper wrote, quote, "There is no more interesting character in Eastern Canada. If her life is not written up, the people of Canada will miss an interesting page in history." From the Winnipeg Tribune, they said, quote, "Her knowledge of the past is startling, and her predictions have had remarkable fulfillments." In 1892, her fame was cemented by a novel, The Witch of Plum Hollow, by Thaddeus Leavitt. And she was praised in 1936 by Harry D. Blanchard, a local historian and newspaper columnist in Eastern Canada, when he said, quote, "Canada has never had as one of its citizens a lady of stronger character or keener intellect than Mother Barnes." Today, the Witch of Plum Hollow homestead still stands. It's a small rural cabin in Kitley Township just north of Belleville. Much of the original structure didn't survive over the years, but the structure has been restored on the same property and is now a heritage site. It was restored to as much as the original as the 1800s appeared as closely as possible. It's a small, shabby log cabin set back from the road and surrounded by trees and tranquil farmland. It is on private property and surrounded by no trespassing signs, although it is often visited by local historian buffs and folklore fans. It more closely, though, resembles a pilgrimage spot rather than an attraction. Once you start digging into a woman like Mother Barnes, you realize she wasn't the only one in Ontario to carry this kind of reputation. She was the most famous, the most documented, but she wasn't alone. Now, once you start digging into a woman like Mother Barnes, you realize she wasn't the only one in Ontario to carry this kind of reputation. She was the most famous, the most documented, but she wasn't alone. Across the province, in one of those tiny rural pockets where superstition and survival lived side by side, there is another woman who slipped into the same role. In Peterborough County, there is the woman remembered only as the Witch of Dummer Township. Dummer Township in mid-1800s was the definition of isolated, thick brush, scattered farms, and communities that relied on each other but also whispered about each other. And within this landscape lived a woman who became known in local folklore and in early Ontario historical papers only as the Witch of the Township. Unlike Mother Barnes, who people sought out for help, the Dummer Township Witch was someone who people approached with caution. She was feared more than admired. Her reputation shows up in real folklore collections, especially in the Ontario Historical Society papers records, where locals described her as a woman believed to have powers to curse livestock, blight crops, and bring misfortune to anyone who crossed her. The farmers would blame her when their cows went dry. Families blamed her when illness swept through homes. If a horse went lame or a child had night terrors, someone would mutter her name. And yet, and this is the part that always gets me, those same people would turn to her when they needed help. I mean, she wasn't just feared. She was also believed to know remedies, charms, and cures. She lived alone on the edge of the community, and the people would visit her in secret. They didn't brag about it the same way they did with Mother Barnes. It was something you didn't speak to with the neighbors. They all went under the cover of night or in the early morning, hoping no one would see them. And she would give them something, a poultice, a charm, a warning, and then they would go home hoping that it would work. Her actual name never made it into the records, mostly because the rural communities in the 1800s didn't write down the names of women that they feared. They wrote down stories instead, and those stories are what survived in Peterborough folklore collections, in early Ontario historical papers, and in oral histories that were eventually archived. She was the perfect counterpart to Mother Barnes. Barnes was the woman people chose to visit. The Dummer Township Witch was the one people avoided until they needed her. Mother Barnes fits into a much larger picture of 19th century Ontario. Her work reflects the way immigrant families built stability through whatever skills they could turn into income. Irish settlers across the Rideau Corridor relied on seasonal labor, small farms, and side work to keep households afloat, and fortune-telling became one of those ways that she supported her family. Her readings also sit alongside the Victorian interest in seance, mediums, and spiritual inquiry. Newspapers in the 1860s and 1870s printed stories often about clairvoyance, and those ideas traveled through taverns, church gatherings, and visiting relatives. People arrived at her cabin with questions shaped by that culture. They wanted answers about marriages, illness, property disputes, and missing livestock. And she gave them what they came for. Her influence reached well beyond the local families who visited her. For example, John A. Macdonald, who saw her not just that one time when she told him he would become Prime Minister, but he saw her several times, and he spoke of these visits often, placing her names in conversations far away from Plum Hollow. Local residents repeated stories about her for decades. Her cottage still remains standing long after her death, and the community groups eventually even restored it. The building still draws visitors who want to see the place where she worked. Her legacy survives through stories told in the area, preserved in the cabin, and the way her name continues to appear in the region history and local tours. And whether she was an actual witch with real psychic abilities, or whether she was just tricking everybody to make a buck, she did give the people of the 19th century one thing that they needed, and that was hope. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Radio Valerie, and on Instagram at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. Also, check us out on Patreon for exclusive creepy Canadian shit. And if you're craving even more haunted history, twisted folklore, check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow that show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.